Okay, this is a demo on service providers, and we basically we're talking about the root application injector, configuring a provider at the root application level, and this particular we talked about that in the last video. This particular video we're going to talk about the component provider scope. So basically, just to review what we did with the root injector, we looked at a demo where we recognized that the root injector, when you configure a provider at the root application level, and you inject that into a UI component tree, let's say a component, maybe a parent component and a child component. When you inject this particular provider into the components, basically Angular will create a singleton instance, and the UI component tree can share that instance. So this is one particular situation where I said, okay, I injected a customer service into this component and the child component. Notice we do have a root component and a child component. And when I do a set info, get info, I could see that I've updated the info in this component. And in this component, we see the new app child service update data, okay? And updated data. And basically, we looked at the code for that. And let's just briefly look at that right now. Okay, so let's just briefly look at that right now. So basically, we have some code, and I have this customer service which I provided in root. And if you look at the app module, I have the root component, the child component. I have a grandchild component here, which we'll take a look at, and I declare those components in the module. I do not provide a list of provider here because that would make it not tree shakeable. So what I do is I use the Angular 6 injectable provide in root, and that makes it tree shakeable. And if you look at the component, you have a constructor, and I've injected the customer service into that component, and within the constructor I set the customer service info, and I go get the info, and I place it in an instance variable inside the component. And so so the root component can always go get and set and get the data from these methods here. So it's a simple example where the component itself is using the singleton instance to get and set data, and also the child and the template itself can binds the click event of the button to setting new info and also getting the info. The getting of the info does set the state variable, so I could render that with the double curly brackets, the interpolation directive in the template. Now notice the template also has a child component. So we look at the child component, and we have the same thing, the customer service. It's the same code, essentially the same code, a different component, different template, same code style, and we inject a customer service in there. Now we set the info in the constructor to child component info. We get the info, we define the info instance variable, and then we have the set and get methods here to set and get the data. What we're showing you is that when you inject the service using that token, which happens to be the same name as the class that we're defining, the application injector is going to give you a reference to the singleton. And so so and if we wanted to look at the template, we could show we could see that the info is being rendered here, and you have the set and get methods, and you could tell who set the info. Was it the child info, the child app service reference, or was it the root component reference? Okay, so let's jump right into it. So we basically see that when we render this, we do have a singleton instance. We have a situation where there's just one constructor happening for the customer service. And once again, the component gets instantiated, then a template gets rendered. It sees the app child selector tag, then the child component gets instantiated, and the child template gets evaluated, and then the init methods happen. And this is important to understand the life cycle of those component instantiations and the rendering. And this is one of the reasons why you put the time-consuming initializations in the init method, not the constructor, because the constructor happens and it has to evaluate the template, and you don't want to delay the rendering of the front-end template markup fragment with anything in the init. Okay, so basically we see that that's the case. We could set info, we can get info, the app service reference updated the info, but the child could still go get it. I could set this and get this, and now the child app set the data in the service. So we basically have a singleton instance which is shared on a UI component tray. Now keep in mind, keep in mind that I could add the grandchild component here to the template. And we could do that. And we showed you that in the last demo, but we could still since the objects got instantiated in a certain order, the grandchild service in the constructor call left the state as a grandchild state. So if you go get this, you'll see that it's a grandchild component info that was set. And if I set this here and I get it, I don't have to get it. I could have got it right here. It's the different state in the service. So we talked about that in detail with the singleton video prior to this one. So now let's do something a little bit different. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to list the provider here. And list the customer service instance here. Okay, so when I do this, this token points to a customer service class. So the token name is the same as the class name. Now, the only class I got in my application code is this one, and it's provided in root. So the app module, if I instantiate that in the root component, which does not list a provider, it's going to use that singleton object that the application injector created. Okay. With the child component, I have to find my own provider. And what that means is the component injector, although it gets handed off the root injector's tokens, it still takes priority in its own tokens. So here I defined a provider token to be customer service. It's going to look for the class customer service and instantiate it. It just so happens it's the same class. I could have used a different class here if I wanted to, but it turns out it's the same class. So this component is going to get its own instance, okay? And I don't. We'll take a look at this, but I don't feel comfortable calling it a private instance because all the children under this component also have a reference. So so let's take a look at what happens with this situation. Okay, so basically let's look at the front end. Okay, we went back to this simple model, and this parent is using the singleton. This root component is using the singleton service. This child component, its component injector created a separate service for its subtree. Okay, so when I set this thing and I get this thing, it doesn't change. If I get the value here, the new state in its service instance happened. Okay, so if I set this and I get it, it's the app component service reference, but it still doesn't affect this component. There's a singleton used at the application root injector scope, and there's a child component where I defined a provider, and its injector is taking the token pointing to its separate private, well, not a private instance, but its own instance for its own subtree. Okay, so it's important to realize that that although I listed this provider here, it's sort of overriding the provider that the application injector passed over to this component injector, and it's overriding it. It's one way to look at it. Lord knows what they're doing on the back end. But the bottom line is, if I call this something else, and I used a different class, then this particular component could have access to the singleton and its own a separate instance, which is created in this component scope. Okay, so let's take a look at that again. Let's take a look at the log file. Let's see how many instances are here. Okay, I've got one customer service constructor, another customer service constructor. Two objects have been created. This one is a singleton. This one is an instance for the child component subtree. Okay, so let's just verify that. Let's go into the child component. Let's add the app grandchild. Let's go into the grandchild. Oh, it does still inject the customer service in it, okay? So you ask yourself, is this going to inject the singleton service or the component scoped object that the component injector created? Now notice I didn't define a providers in the meta tag up here. So this particular injector, the component injector, is going to pass off the token pointing to the instance for the child component subtree, not the instance, the token pointing to the singleton instance. Okay, so let's verify that. Okay, so first in the log file, let's take a quick look. Customer service, customer service. There's only two instances of customer service. 1, 2. Okay, so now the question is, what instance when you look at this UI component tree, this last constructor set the grandchild component info in the service. And then I went to get it, put it in its instance variable, and that's the thing I'm rendering here. If I do this up here, it doesn't get it. If I do this get up here, it does get it. These two, the child and the grandchild, are sharing the same instance. Okay, so basically, I do a set here, I do a get here. Oh, the app child service reference, which is the same as the grandchild service reference, actually set the data. So keep in mind, it's as long as you remember what instances you have there, then it's important to realize that you have these separate instances, and some instances could be singleton, some instances could be just at a component level, some instances could be shared in the UI component tree at the component level. Okay, so let's with that in mind, let's just let me just summarize in a different perspective. Okay, the application injector had provider tokens, and those providers were configured at the root injector, and they're pointing to singleton instances. When the child component gets instantiated and there's a provider tag there, there's a child injector, the Angular takes the application root injector tokens and gives the child access to those tokens. But if you define another provider with the same token key, the child component can override it, and it could point to its own instance. Okay, and here this grandchild component didn't override the child component. It would have had its own instance, but right now it's sharing the instance with its parent. Okay, so let's take a look at, let's go one step further here. Let's go to the child component, and let's add a provider in the grandchild component. Okay, so basically, you're back to the original example from a visual point of view, but in this particular example, you've got a singleton object accessible from the root injector. We're injecting the same token into the child component, but the child component is defining its own providers inside its add component annotation, and so is the child. So let's suppose I set this thing, I could get it, and it says app child service. If I get it here, it doesn't affect this one. This one has its own object. If I set this one and get it, it's the grandchild service data. It's because they're using separate instances. So right now there's a singleton instance up here. There's a separate instance for this child component. And although that it could be shared with the UI component tree, this grandchild has its own component instance because it also has a provider's tag. So basically, these don't affect each other at all. So how many instances are there? There's 3 in this scenario. Customer service provider, customer service, in the constructor, there's 3 customer service instances here. Okay, and let's just walk through probably the last scenario that I want to talk about. Let's go back, and I'm going to simplify this a little bit. Let me go back here and remove this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the app component, and I'm going to duplicate this one. Okay, and so now what happens in that scenario where you have 2 instances of the child component template? Well, what happens is this root component, the root injector is providing the provider is configured as a singleton. So when I set this guy and get this guy, right now this root component is the only one that's using that singleton service. This child component has its own instance, and now this child component has its own instance. Why? because this component instance, template instance for the child is different than this one. So the component injector created its own instance for this guy. So if I set this guy and then I get it up here, it's not affected. It's only affected here. If I go and get this again, it's not affected. Only this component service can set its state. So basically you got a different scenario there. And then, and that's really probably all I wanted to show you, but we can even go one step further here. Let's go back and put this here. Okay, now remember the grandchild has its own customer service. So now we're looking at this situation, and the question is how many instances are being used here. Well, the root component's using a singleton instance. It's the root injector is the provider is configured at the root injector level, so that has its own instance. So if we set it and get it, none of these components will get. Okay. Now let's look at this guy here. This child component has its own object instance, which could have been shared with, because in the component metadata we added another provider to the child info. It could have been shared with the grandchild, but the grandchild defined a provider info. So once again, you got set, you got get. Nothing happens if you get it up here. You got new info set in the app. You get it over here, it's not affected because this child info has its own instance. You go to get that here, the instance for this customer service is not the same as this one. So here you got app child service, and so basically what you got is you've got one singleton service, and you've got an instance for this child, an instance for this grandchild, an instance for this child, and an instance for this grandchild. So you essentially have 5 instances here where one's a singleton. Okay. Now keep in mind that it's a UI component tree. You know, if I put another child that's not the grandchild under this child, it would use the child info service provider, because maybe it's not providing its own service instance. So it gets complicated as you look at the UI component tree and different children, different branches, but you get the gist. So yeah, so anyway, going back, if I go into the grandchild and I remove that customer service, then this child provided an object instance that this grandchild can use. But also this child provided its own instance for its own subtree. So when I do a set here and I do a get here, the grandchild set the data, but if I do a get here and get here, it didn't get affected. So the problem with some of the stuff going on here is that basically, let's try it again. Okay, so first let me look at the log file and I'll explain to you why we're getting some weird behavior here. So how many customer services are there? There's 1, 2, 3. Okay, yeah, so in this scenario, right, I took out the component annotation for the child info. So, but if you look at the initialization of some of the things and the way it occurred, let me just let's just paint a simple picture here. This guy has its own singleton instance, and the constructor created the state in its service and went to go get it. And that's why it says app info here. Okay? If I set it and go get it, it's now saying app component service because the method itself changed the service data, and now I'm getting it. In this particular situation, when I click on this thing here, the components got constructed in an order, and they got initialized in an order. So the last thing that happened with the state of the service is the grandchild set it in its constructor. And so so if I click on this get right here, I'll get this grandchild info, right? So this is what happened. It's a little bit confusing. But if I do a set and I do a get, then we try to get this here, and I have the child app info service. So it gets a little confusing. The bottom line is this child and this grandchild are now using the same service instance, because child's the only one that provided the token and configured the provider. So this grandchild it's a child of this child, basically uses the state of that service because it's the same service instance. And that's the same thing down here too. Okay, so these both set the app. This should return grandchild, right? So let's not confuse you. The bottom line is there's different ways you can configure these, and that's all I really wanted to show for the demo. As far as component provider scope, and I'd say be careful defining it to be a private instance. It's not necessarily. It's a private instance for a UI subtree, starting with the component that defined the provider. But try to be careful saying that it's the scope of the token that's pointing to the instance, which you're looking at the UI tree and looking at who can see that or who cannot, who's using a singleton instance, who's using a component scoped instance, etc. Okay, so let's and that's all we have to say for the component provider scope.